One way or the other familiar with Henry VIII. My own interest in Henry VIII stems from the Reformation, the man who first sold the idea of the national church, which has had a tremendous political impact subsequently. But Tudor history usually used to be written in the most dreary form at one time. I don't know if Suzannah would agree with this, but she's certainly one of those, the new breed of historians on Tudor England, who certainly altered the way in which the stories have been told, the stories have been narrated. Apart from writing and teaching, she's also quite an accomplished documentary filmmaker, in the sense she presents them. And she has done a few on Tudor Britain and made it quite appealing to a generation which is otherwise put off. And perhaps one of the ways in which an introduction to Tudor England is best served is by reliving the story of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, which in recent times has had some reflection in television serials like Wolf Hall, or earlier in Man for All Seasons, which is the life of Thomas More, or even Anne of the Thousand Days, in which some of you may have seen that. But it is really a story which continues to interest everybody. There are theories, conspiracy theories, and different ways of looking at what could be a love story, what could be a political plot, what could be various other things. So I'm not going to take up much time on this. This is a story which is best told by one of the best storytelling historians of contemporary Britain, Suzannah Lipscomb.
Well, some of the best storytelling historians aren't available, but I'm here to substitute for them. ये कई वर्षों के बाद से मैं हिंदी में बात दिया गया हूँ और मेरी हिंदी आजकल बहुत अभ्यास से बाहर है, तो मुझे हिंदी में कोई प्रश्न नहीं पूछ रहे हो, मुझे माफ़ कर दे, लेकिन मुझे बोलना चाहिए कि मैं जयपुर में यहाँ आकर बहुत खुश हूँ। मेरी बात एक अंग्रेज़ी राजा और रानी के बारे में करने के लिए आने के लिए धन्यवाद। मुझे लगती है कि मैं अंग्रेज़ी में मेरी कहानी बाकी बता देना चाहिए। फिर से धन्यवाद। And thank you too to JLF for inviting me, to Cox and Kings for sponsoring Charbagh, and BBC World Histories magazine for sponsoring this session. So I'm going to be telling you a story. Kahani is the right word. A love story. A story between a man and a woman. The man just happened to be the King of England. And when we think of Henry VIII, who was king between 1509 and 1547, you might think of this picture. Hopefully these will be coming up on your screens very soon. And hold on a second, just a pause here. This is the great famous picture that Holbein produced, which is of Henry with the broad shoulders and who's got his splayed feet. Up there at the terrace, could you please put the PowerPoint projector on the screen for everyone to see? I have a lot of pictures, chiefly because I realize that if you don't have lots of pictures, they focus the camera on you and do close-ups. So I thought I'd try and get away from that. Here we go, Swapan, but we wouldn't, not Henry VIII. Anyway, we have this idea about Henry that gives us, I'm just going to hope they come, which is an idea of Henry as a man who was a tyrant, who was someone who was monstrous, a wife killer. We know he had 6 wives and killed 2 of them. We have a sense that, he became fat and terrible, and these things are all true. But they aren't true of Henry in the first few years of his reign and his life. When he came to the throne in 1509, he was acknowledged as being good-looking, accomplished, and kind. good looking, we have to rely, here we go, thank you very much. So these are the values we attach to this picture, none of them particularly positive. But when he came to the throne, he was known for being good looking. We have to perhaps rely more on the documentary evidence than on the pictures here. We're told that he had, by chronicler Edward Hall, an amiable personage, that he had a princely countenance. Or the Venetian ambassador, Sebastian Justinian, said that he had a round face so very beautiful that it would become a pretty woman. He was 6'2" when the average height of a man was 5'7". He was athletic. He was very handsome. But he was also accomplished. We might know that he could speak a number of languages, that he played every musical instrument in the room to entertain a visiting French embassy in 1517, that he was a capital horseman, a fine jouster, that he surpassed all the archers of his guard at archery. And Justinian again said that to see him play tennis was the prettiest thing in the world. I think he had a bit of a crush. But also, the thing that's surprising about Henry is that he was kind. So we have reports saying that he is affable and gracious, a man who harmed no one. Erasmus said that he's a man of gentle friendliness, and gentle in debate. He acts more like a companion than a king. And that's as late as 1529, 20 years after he came to the throne. And it's that version of Henry VIII that we're going to be talking about today, but we're also going to be talking about how he changed to the later one. So he came to the throne seeming to be this golden Renaissance prince in 1509. He was proclaimed king on the 21st of April, and one of his first acts, 51 days into his reign, was to marry his brother's widow, Catherine of Aragon. Catherine of Aragon was 6 years older than him and had been married to his brother in 1502 for 5 months before his brother Arthur died. Catherine would later swear that the marriage had never been consummated. They were both teenagers at the time. When Henry decided that he wanted to marry Catherine, he needed to get a dispensation from the Pope, Julius II, to allow him to marry someone who was so closely related to him. He did this, and he and Catherine were crowned together on the 24th of June, 4 days before his 18th birthday. And they seem to have been very much in love. He wrote to his father-in-law in July 1509 of that entire love which we bear the most serene queen, our consort, day by day her inestimable values more and more shine forth, flourish, increase. So it's encouraging that a couple of months into the wedding he still felt that fondly about her. But he also went to joust wearing this armour with H and K, their initials intertwined. And he did this particularly at the tournament of 1511. This tournament was to celebrate the birth of their son and heir, Prince Henry. In fact, it was Catherine of Aragon's second pregnancy. She had miscarried in 1510. But what was terribly sad about it was that 7 weeks after the boy was born, he died. And this was the beginning of a heartbreaking litany of miscarriages, stillbirths, and infant mortalities. Catherine was pregnant 6 times. And yet, out of those pregnancies, only one child, a girl, a daughter, survived. Mary, born in 1516. Later, Mary I. And when in 1519, Henry's mistress, Elizabeth Bessie Blount, bore him a son, he started to think that it wasn't his fault they didn't have a boy. Now, this mattered because the succession hung on a thin thread. Henry and most people at the time believed that one of his principal responsibilities as heir was to produce an adult male heir, adult meaning about 15 years old, by the time he was in his, to produce that child by the time he was in his 30s, so that by the time he died, there could be a peaceful, secure succession. Princesses married other kings and princes. They would bring the country under foreign rule. And children needed regents, which in the century before had led to civil war. So he needed a secure line of princes. He needed a male heir. And not just a male heir. As the death of his brother had shown, he needed an heir and a spare, just in case one died. And he needed to do that quickly because his grandparents, his grandfathers had died at the age of 26 and 41. His father had died at the age of 52. He needed to get on with it. He needed an heir, and he needed it soon. In 1525, his illegitimate son was made a duke. Horrible slight to his wife, Catherine of Aragon, though we're not really telling her story today. But she had entered her 40s by this point. She hadn't conceived for 6 years, and it was becoming clear that she wasn't going to give him the male heir he'd so desperately needed. And then he met a woman he thought might solve the problem. Enter Anne Boleyn. Much about Anne Boleyn is mysterious. There are many things that we don't know about her, like when she was born, what exactly she looked like, and chiefly for our story, why she died. We know her family. We know that she was born to Thomas Boleyn, son of Sir William Boleyn of Blickling and Margaret Butler, and to Elizabeth, the daughter of Thomas Howard, 2nd Duke of Norfolk. So she was high-born, she was gentry. Some people say she was a self-made woman. That's absolutely rot. Her father had served as a courtier to Henry VIII, and Anne was one of 3 children that would be born to him and his wife who would survive to adulthood. We don't know when she was born because this was before the time when parish registers needed to be kept, charting baptisms. That started in 1538. And she was a girl, so no one bothered to write it down. So she was either born in 1507, which means that when she met Henry, she was 19 years old, and we might assume that he had a taste for younger women. Or she was born in 1501, which meant that the relationship started when she was 26. And the evidence seems to be in favour of that earlier date. This is the evidence. It's a letter she wrote in 1513, and you might not be able to see it from here, but it's not the hand of a sort of 5-year-old. It's a very delicate hand, and it makes sense that she wrote this letter from abroad when she'd been sent away for finishing, to learn continental manners, to learn to speak French, to learn to dance. Because she was sent in 1513 to the court of Margaret, Archduchess of Austria. She was one of 18 maids of honour there, and she was described as being bright and pleasant for her young age. Then Henry's younger sister, Mary, was married off to the King of France. Mary was 18 years old. The King of France was 52. The marriage didn't last long. He was obviously so excited that 3 months later he expired. But Anne went to serve as one of her ladies, and when she went back to England, Anne remained behind in France and served the next queen, Queen Claude, and stayed there for 7 years. Now, Claude was pious and sophisticated, also continually pregnant, and quite a good example to Anne of how you really should be a queen. So after all this time, Anne returned to England. And now we get to our next mystery. Why did she attract Henry VIII? I mean, what did she look like for a start? The myth is that, Henry ditched the dowdy old Catherine of Aragon and driven wild by the beautiful Anne Boleyn, and that it was love at first sight. But it wasn't. Anne came to the court, where we see her first record of March 1522, when she came to the court, as we have depicted here in the Tudors, to play in a Shrove pageant called Chateau Vert, the part of Perseverance, or the Tudors would have said Perseverance, which would turn out to be terribly apt. And a Boleyn girl did have Henry's eye at the time, but it wasn't Anne. When he went out to joust, wearing the banner, Elle mon cœur Navarra, she has conquered my heart, he wasn't talking about Anne, but about her sister, as you might know from the other Boleyn girl, a non-Oscar-winning film for various reasons. But Henry was once asked later in life if it is true that he had slept with Anne's sister and her mother, and he replied gruffly, never with the mother. Anyway, so Henry's interest in her seems to have begun around 1526. We have a letter from him that we can date 1527 that said he'd been struck for more than a year by the dart of love. So what did he see in our hero or heroine here? Would he have been bowled over by our protagonist's good looks? Well, no. Would it surprise you to learn that Anne was not a beautiful woman? She probably didn't look like the lovely Natalie Dormer. In fact, we don't really know what she looked like.
you might be familiar with this portrait. This is a standard glamorous portrait of her, and it's in various iterations, reproductions, but the earliest of these dates from 50 to 60 years after her death, so during the reign of her daughter. There is no surviving accepted portrait from her lifetime. There are some other possibilities. There's this ring that Elizabeth wore, which shows a picture of Elizabeth and possibly a picture of her mother. It looks similar to that portrait, but it also could be Elizabeth herself at a young age. There's this sketch by Holbein that an 18th century hand inscribed Anne Boleyn. But the problem is, it's very unlikely to be her because you wouldn't depict a queen in such a state of undress. This is another one that's claimed to be her, but again is open to question. And this one also is said to be her. It's called the Nid Hall painting, and she's wearing a gable hood. This, however, is strikingly like a picture of Henry's third wife, Jane Seymour, depicted here. Maybe it's actually her. Although it is similar to the only accepted likeness from her lifetime, not a portrait, but a medal, cast in 1534 when she was thought to be pregnant. And although it's damaged, we can get certain clues. We've got the long oval face, the high cheekbones, and it's been reimagined recently to give us an even clearer reconstruction. So we have to rely a little bit more on what our written sources say. We have Nicholas Sander saying that Anne had black hair, sallow, jaundiced skin, 6 fingers on one hand, a projecting tooth, and a large wart on her chin. Well, obviously, one man's wart is another man's beauty spot. But Nicholas was writing during the reign of Elizabeth's daughter, and he was a Catholic. So there are reasons to disbelieve his account, especially the bit about the 6 fingers. At the time, we've got the Venetian diplomat, Francesco Sanuto, describing her as not one of the handsomest women in the world, of middling stature, a swarthy complexion, a long neck, a wide mouth, a bosom not much raised, although he does grant her eyes that are black and beautiful. And one of her friends described her as good-looking enough, which I suppose is true, ultimately. So she wasn't a beauty, but she had, this dark hair, tanned skin, flashing dark eyes. It wasn't her beauty. It was her character and intelligence and charm that attracted Henry. So even Sander will agree that she is amusing in her ways, that she could play musical instruments and dance terribly well. We have accounts talking of her excellent grace and behaviour, her fashionable mode of dress. And a Frenchman described her as that no one would ever have taken her to be English by her manners, but a native-born Frenchwoman, which is probably the highest compliment a French person can pay an English person. So she had learnt cosmopolitan glamour. She had learnt sophisticated conversational wit and that graceful epitome of courtly life. She knew how to dance. This is the crux of Anne's desirability. Henry didn't like his women stupid or dumb, with one rebound exception we'll come to in due course, but he liked them to be fierce, intelligent, and passionate. Anne might not have been beautiful, but she was brilliant. The next question we have the meeting in 1526. And one of the questions that's dogged history is whether they were lovers. We know that Anne conceived in late 1532 or early 1533 and gave birth in 1533, September. That means they waited 6 or 7 years to consummate their relationship. Some historians have found this totally improbable, but they forget that they're writing in the age after the pill. At their time, there was no reliable contraception methods. Your options were a condom made out of a pig's gut or some herbs to try and bring on menstruation, none of which particularly reliable or indeed appealing. They do seem, therefore, to have sustained a pretty chaste relationship up until they were married or as damn near as. And they were very much in love. By complete fluke, his love letters to her survive in the Vatican. Her letters to him don't survive, which I think sometimes gives us a false picture of it being driven by one side. But he wrote to her, his one, in which he describes that he is longing, says, "I'm longing for you," and it signs it off, "written with the hand of him which I would were yours." In this second one, it's written by the hand of him whose body and will are yours. He says it's a most loyal and assured servant. And I particularly like this one because at the bottom he signs it like an infatuated schoolboy. It says, Autre ne cherche, I'm not looking for any other, and then he puts her initials in a love heart. Can you see that? Anne Boleyn. But it is true that the letters reveal some degree of sexual play between the couple. This one is addressed to mine own sweetheart. And he says, wishing myself of an evening in my sweetheart's arms, whose pretty ducks I trust shortly to kiss. Ducks is the Tudor slang for breasts. We only have one message from Anne to Henry that's reliable, written in a book of hours. I don't know if you can see that. It says, Le temps viendra, je Anne Boleyn. The time will come, I Anne Boleyn. And of course, she might be talking about the resurrection, which is depicted here. But it looks also like this was something passed in a chapel to each other, sending notes, saying, don't worry, time is coming. We're going to get married soon. Of course, this is all very well, desperately in love and everything, but, you know, there is an obstacle. Catherine of Aragon. How to get out of his marriage. In 1527, Henry started to look into the possibility of an annulment of his marriage to Catherine on the grounds that the dispensation that Pope Julius II had granted, allowing him to marry his brother's widow, was inadequate in some way. This was a reasonable request. Earlier that year, in March, in fact, of 1527, his sister, Margaret Tudor, his older sister, had had her second marriage annulled by Pope Clement VII at that time. The French king, Louis XII, back in 1498, had had his marriage annulled. It was a perfectly reasonable, normal request. But Henry's timing was terrible. In May 1527, Rome had been sacked by the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V, and Pope Clement had been put in prison in his own castle of Sant'Angelo. And Charles V, who had imprisoned him, just happened to be Catherine of Aragon's nephew. So he wasn't going to allow his aunt to be dishonoured by the disrespect that would be accorded her in a divorce. The most that the Pope could do, or would do, was to send a papal legate, his representative, to England to judge the case, along with Henry's servant, Cardinal Thomas Wolsey. So he sent Cardinal Lorenzo Campeggio. But there were massive delays. When he finally agreed to send the legate, it was December 1527. Campeggio didn't arrive until September 1528, and even then he prevaricated. The trial wasn't held until 1529 in July, so he was clearly under orders to drag the business out for as long as possible. When the trial finally began, Henry explained to those gathered there that he had been struck by a scrupulosity of conscience that troubled his mind. He said that he really felt that it was wrong for him to marry his brother's widow and that God was punishing him by not giving him sons. Unfortunately for Henry and his scrupulosity of conscience, at that point Catherine appeared unexpectedly, begged him on her knees not to leave her in a very touching speech, and refused to accept the judge's authority, meaning that the case had to be evoked, taken back to Rome. This picture of Catherine I particularly like because you've got the monkey. Normally, he would be reaching for the coin, of course, on which there is the king's head. But the monkey in this picture is reaching for the cross. Catherine will go the way of truth, the way of the church, and not the king's way. So, July 1529, the case went back to Rome, and by this point, of course, more than 2 years had passed. Henry and Anne had been in love for 3 years. You can sense the frustration mounting. Henry lost his faith in the Pope and in the ability of Wolsey, his servant, to secure him an annulment, and Wolsey was arrested. Henry now needed a new strategy, and he shifted from focusing on the dispensation to focusing on the biblical texts that prohibited the marriage of a man to his brother's wife. 2 verses in Leviticus that said, if a man married his brother's wife, they would be childless. And Henry used this as evidence, of course, for the reason he didn't have sons. They did have a girl, but let's not worry about that. Despite the fact that Deuteronomy 25:6 has a verse saying the absolute opposite, that a man must marry his brother's widow, never mind that either. So he appointed a team of experts, led by Thomas Cranmer, to look into the matter. And 2 years later, they produced a defence titled the Sufficiently Full Collection that justified this point. The second strand of this new strategy was that Henry had come to believe that he was God's anointed deputy on earth, that he was first under God. And Anne Boleyn helped him with this by giving him a book by William Tyndale called The Obedience of a Christian Man, in which Tyndale said that it was shameful for princes to be under the authority of popes. And Henry, on reading this, apparently said, "This is the book for me and all kings to read." When the experts reported in 1531, it set in train a series of events, a series of acts of parliament that would establish ultimately Henry as supreme head of the Church of England. The Act of 1531, which was a charge of praemunire, or treason by allegiance or obedience to a foreign power, that he charged the whole clergy of England with. It's okay, though, he pardoned them if they gave him £100,000. And then there's the boringly named but utterly crucial 1533 Act in Restraint of Appeals. The preamble to this described the realm of England as an empire. Now, what this meant was that no foreign ruler could have authority over England. This meant that the king was the final legal authority on matters religious and secular, and it also meant that Catherine couldn't appeal to Rome. And finally, the Act of Supremacy of 1534, which declared that Henry was and always had been the supreme head of the Church of England. They just hadn't noticed it recently. Meanwhile, his marriage to Catherine had been made null and void. In fact, truth be told, he'd already married Anne Boleyn. He married her secretly, we think, late in 1532, privately in January 1533, and officially in May 1533, on the 25th. On the 4th of... And that was all before, the 4th of May, that was all before he had his marriage to Catherine annulled later in May. So, you know, you could say he was a bigamist, but of course he wasn't, because he'd never really been married to Catherine of Aragon. Anne was then crowned queen on the 1st of June 1533. And all this haste came from the fact that Anne was pregnant. They were hoping that she was going to provide the boy that he had been waiting for. She gave birth in September 1533, and it was a girl who would later be Elizabeth and Elizabeth I. But they didn't know that then. Still, healthy girl, bodes well for the future. For the next few years, Henry and Anne seem to have been happily married. Here's their initials intertwined in the Great Hall at Hampton Court, which he built for her. But happily being married was not enough. Henry wanted the whole kingdom to be complicit in the decision that he had made, even in their thoughts. In the Act of Succession of 1534, he made all his subjects, well, all his male subjects, swear an oath recognising Queen Anne and saying that they would believe and take her for the rightful queen and lawful wife of the king. There were those who couldn't swear to this because it also meant accepting Henry as supreme head. Sir Thomas More, Bishop John Fisher, and Carthusian monks who were executed, but everyone else went along with it. The same year that this act was passed, it's possible that Anne miscarried. That medal was cast for her. I say it's possible she miscarried because we have accounts from the Imperial Ambassador Eustace Chapuis saying that she had a goodly belly. And then we have an account from him saying that the king had begun to doubt whether she was enceinte, pregnant or not. Now, why would the king begin to doubt it? It suggests that actually what had happened was there had been no birth and no miscarriage. We obviously know about miscarriages at the time, they weren't hushed up. Maybe it was a case of pseudo-ciesis or phantom pregnancy. This happened to women in the 16th century who desperately wanted to be pregnant, and the brain is an amazing thing. It can produce the symptoms of pregnancy, well, all except the child. The belly swells up, the breasts start to produce milk, and yet there is no baby. So maybe Anne miscarried, maybe she didn't in 1534. But what is certain is that she miscarried in January 1536. The child was at 3.5 months. And as luck would have it, she miscarried on the day of Catherine of Aragon's funeral, after Catherine had lived out the rest of her life in what Dermot McCulloch has described as years of dignified misery. Now, was this the beginning of the end for Anne? Because 4 months later, Anne Boleyn, Queen of England, was executed on charges of adultery, incest, and conspiring the death of the king. And this is our final mystery to solve today. Why did this happen? Because historians are really divided about why Anne died. There are several different theories. Theory number one is that she was just guilty of the charges against her. Theory number two is that it was a conspiracy by a man called Thomas Cromwell, who was the king's first minister, to get rid of Anne. This idea rests on seeing Henry as a puppet who, to quote one of the historians who says that, could be bounced into action when the time was right. An alternative view comes from those who see Henry as already a monster, that he decided he'd had enough of his wife, off with her head, he was tired of her abrasive character and got rid of her. But I'm going to try and persuade you of another theory today, that actually Anne wasn't guilty, that it wasn't a conspiracy, and that Henry didn't want to get rid of her, and that as a result, her death was devastating to him, and that devastation influenced the course of history. Let's look very briefly at the theories. So, was Anne guilty? Well, when Anne was in the Tower, she declared that she was innocent on peril of her soul's damnation, both before and after taking the Eucharist. Very serious act in this religious age, especially if you think you're going to meet your Maker quite soon afterwards. And apart from one person, everybody else, all of those accused with her, she was accused of sleeping with 5 men, including her brother, swore that they were innocent too. And if we look at the indictment against her, which can be seen in the National Archives, we can chart the charges against her, and even at a distance of 500 years, can disprove 75% of them. You know, they say something like, on the 7th of December, 1533, Anne Boleyn was at X place with X man, and we can prove that, indeed, she actually wasn't there. So they look like they've been trumped up. In fact, there's only one historian who's still arguing that maybe Anne was guilty, and in his book, Fatal Attractions, George Bernard gives the final line that we should give her the Scottish verdict of not proven. He says, we can't prove that she was guilty, but that doesn't mean she was innocent. Still, I think we need to move on from charges of guilt. I think it's fairly clear that she was innocent. So what about the idea of a conspiracy by Thomas Cromwell? Well, this is an intriguing idea, and I'd say it's actually the orthodoxy. Most historians would say this these days, and you've seen it on films probably too. But the thing is, the idea that Cromwell, who was Anne's erstwhile ally, would turn against her hangs pretty much on one piece of evidence. And it hangs on a letter from Eustace Chapuis, the imperial ambassador to Charles V. The letter was written in French. He was talking about a conversation that he had had with Cromwell. And Cromwell had said to him, Il se mit à fantasier et conspirer le dit affaire. He set himself to think up and conspire the said affair, literally. So one historian, for example, has rendered this to say, it was he, Cromwell, very Mantellian construction there, it was he, Cromwell, who had planned and brought about the whole affair. And you think, so far, so fair, right? That looks like a conspiracy. The word conspirer is there. But historians are tricksome characters, and we don't always tell you everything you need to know. And one of the things you need to know is the context, the line before. The line before says this: he himself, meaning Cromwell, had been authorised and commissioned by the king to bring to an end the mistress's trial, to do which he had taken considerable trouble. It was he who had planned and brought about the whole affair. The question here, then, is that according to Cromwell, Henry had authorised him himself. He had commissioned it himself. And the matter of the whole affair, therefore, seems to relate actually to the trial. It's not a conspiracy so much as Cromwell doing what he's told. So, according to Cromwell, we can't take Henry out of the picture. And if that's true, did Henry want to get rid of Anne? Well, Henry
just a minute,
Anne,
Suzannah.
okay.
Excuse me. This is a conversation. Can we have the drama outside, please? Excuse me?
Have we got some big, strong men who might take this man somewhere else? maybe he's recreating the sort of tensions and fury that existed at this time, the anxieties of the period. Henry and Anne certainly had a sort of relationship of sunshine and storms, and maybe we've had sunshine on this side and storms over here, right? You know. Okay. I'm going to carry on. Is that okay with everyone? So Henry and Anne appeared to have been merry together. This lovely Tudor phrase, they're described as being merry together. In fact, more than Henry and any of his other wives. And indeed, throughout the autumn of 1535, which was when Anne got pregnant again. And so maybe one thinks that actually things had gone into decline after the miscarriage. In fact, there's one American historian that argues that actually Anne gave birth to a deformed child, and that this is why Henry didn't like her, that this was an indication of witchcraft. But again, this is one of those things that's based on one piece of evidence, a piece of evidence from 50 years after the event. Nicholas Sander, again, that Catholic, saying that Anne had given birth to a shapeless mass of flesh, and actually we can't trust it very much. But maybe you're thinking Henry had moved on. Maybe he'd met his next wife. And indeed, Jane Seymour would in the future be his next wife. But we have a problem here as well, because Henry describes Jane as the lady whom he serves. We know that he was flirting with this woman, but he describes her as the lady whom he serves. And this is a telling phrase because it refers to courtly love. Courtly love was necessary at a court where there were 200 women and 1,000 men, generally between the ages of 15 and 24, and one needed to do something to sublimate all that erotic desire. So the boys played court to the ladies. They would write them songs and poetry, they would give them gifts, and the women were required to respond only with kindness. I think it's a great system. I think we should bring it back. But Henry describes Jane as the lady whom he serves. This means that she's probably his courtly love mistress. I think the worst case scenario is that he was thinking of making her his actual mistress. But what there's no evidence to sustain at all before Anne is in the Tower is that he was thinking of making her his wife. In fact, as late as the 18th of April 1536, Henry stages an event whereby Eustace Chapuis, that imperial ambassador, has to bow to Anne in the chapel. He's never done it before, and because he's an ambassador, he represents the person of the Holy Roman Emperor himself, and bowing to Anne is to acknowledge her as queen. Why would Henry go to this trouble if he were planning to get rid of his wife very shortly thereafter? So, in fact, I think we need to move on. It's not a conspiracy, Anne wasn't guilty, and Henry didn't want to get rid of her. So why did the case start? Well, we have to turn here to a source produced in June 1536 by a man called Lancelot Descartes. He was writing in French and in poetry, and partly for those reasons historians have overlooked it. But he was writing after the events, immediately after the events at hand, and he was describing something he had seen because he was the secretary to the bishop, the French ambassador. And what he told us is this, that one of Anne's women, Elizabeth Brown, Countess of Worcester, had been accused by her brother of loose living. And she said, well, you know, I'm paraphrasing, but if you think I'm bad, you should see the Queen. She entertains men late at night in her rooms, including her brother, nudge, nudge, wink, wink. Okay. And this was pyrotechnic intelligence. So faced with this, her brother, Anthony Brown, went and told Cromwell and another man called Sir William Fitzwilliam. And Cromwell didn't know what to do, went and told the king. Henry apparently blanched. He was very reluctant to believe it. He nevertheless ordered an investigation. And this is where we're corroborated by the other account that we have from Cromwell speaking to Chapuis, that he was authorised and commissioned by the king. So Cromwell went to look into it. But according to this source, and this isn't corroborated by any other source, but it's interesting, Cromwell was told that if it turned out not to be true, it would be on pain of death for the person who'd brought him the account. This is what the king said. This is the old medieval principle of lex talionis, that if you slander somebody and then they're actually not guilty, then you will suffer the penalty they would have suffered. Now, I think this rather loads the dice somewhat, doesn't it? I mean, Cromwell is going to find evidence of Anne's guilt. If that is true, it changes everything. Because what Cromwell did next was he arrested this guy, a guy so insignificant we don't have a picture of him, Mark Smeaton, a commoner, a musician at the Queen's court. Smeaton was interrogated, possibly under torture, the accounts vary, and he confessed to sexual intercourse with the Queen on 3 occasions. Now, it's very unlikely that a man of his standing could ever have been alone with the Queen. So then why did he confess to it? Well, there's some evidence to suggest that he was somewhat simple. There's other evidence to suggest that he felt that this was a kind of kudos and glory conferred on him, and maybe he was just tortured. But the key thing is his confession tainted everything that followed it. After this point in time, we have an irresistible presumption of guilt. And you can see this in the timing. Smeaton was questioned on the 30th of April, 1536. Anne and her brother were arrested on the 2nd of May. And by the 19th of May, Anne and all the men accused with her had been executed. This is summary justice. This isn't time for a proper investigation. And the evidence that was used against Anne, well, many of the trial documents are missing, but I think we can conclude that it's courtly love again, because Anne was at the centre of this world of courtly love, and what she was, the sort of queen bee of the hive. And we have some accounts dredged up by Anne when she was in the Tower. What's so horrific is she was in the Tower and she didn't know why, so she thought back over what she'd done and said and the conversation she'd had. But she didn't know that everything she said was being passed by the ladies who were attending her to the Constable of the Tower, Sir William Kingston, and he was writing letters to Cromwell reporting it. So one of the things she said was that she remembered a conversation with Henry Norris in which she'd said to him, "You look for dead men's shoes, for if aught came to the king but good, you would look to have me." In other words, you want to marry me when my husband's dead, don't you? And it's this piece of evidence that must explain why she was accused of conspiring the king's death. She needed to be accused of that because adultery and incest weren't treasonous. Conspiring the king's death under the Act of Treason of 1534, imagine the king's death in words counted. And this is probably why Anne died. But we need to think about the impact this had on Henry. If I'm right, and if Henry believed that she was guilty, believed that she had slept with 5 men, imagine how devastating that would have been. This woman that he had moved heaven and earth to be with. He waited 7 long years to marry. And now she has betrayed him. Utterly devastating. We know that he cried over his children, saying Anne had slept with upwards of 100 men. He put money and time and energy into plans for her execution. This picture's not actually accurate because she was executed by a French swordsman who could behead a woman while she knelt. And the swordsman was paid £23, 6 shillings and 8 pence. The Hans Holbein, the court painter, was paid £30 a year. This is someone making sure it's done properly. And also, there was something else. In this period of time, a woman's adultery was thought to suggest her husband's lack of sexual dominance. And in the trial against Anne and her brother had been given a piece of paper which he was told not to read out loud. But he obviously thought, I'm going down, I'm going to take Henry with me. So he read it out. And what it said was that Anne had told her brother that Henry was not skillful in copulating with a woman and had neither vigour nor potency. That's a direct quote. That was said in front of a crowd of 2,000 people. So this is why we see Henry going out dancing with the ladies late at night and marrying Jane Seymour 11 days after Anne's death. He's trying to prove, in our contemporary parlance, that he's still got it. All right, and if you don't believe me, look at the pictures. This is Henry before 1536, wan and anemic and insubstantial. He has Holbein paint him a new picture in 1536. Look at that masculinity, the sort of clenched jaw, the shoulders so broad they don't even fit into the picture. And this is, of course, the basis of the picture you all know. This is the sketch that's at the National Portrait Gallery in London. Look at that. Henry is anatomically impossibly wide at the top there, those shoulders. Here is it in colour, where Henry, this was painted on a wall in Whitehall Palace. It was 9 foot by 12 foot. He's actually bigger than life size. He's been stretched like a model on the cover of Vogue to make him look bigger than he was. And Holbein made this masterful change, and he changed Henry's face to stare out with this kind of bovine intensity at the spectator. But the other thing you need to note about the picture is that Henry's body forms 2 triangles. His broad shoulders, and then tapering to the waist, those splayed feet, also tapering to the waist, to focus the gaze on his bulging codpiece, which is differently coloured, which his hands frame, and which there's the bow above in case you haven't noticed it yet, because this is a picture that is all about virility, fertility, and potency. And it's no wonder that if you're a courtier at Henry VIII's court, you get yourself a copy. That's why there are so many of them kicking about. We have this picture at Hampton Court when Henry maintains the pose while seated. We also have this as the basis of our depiction of Henry VIII. We've bought into the lie. Okay, so Charles Lawton, when he was the first person to play Henry in English, maintained the pose whilst walking, which produced something of an awkward waddle. And of course, it's been parodied ever since as well. Here we go. And I would suggest to you that it has become the default image of masculinity, because who else can you think of who has a billowing gown, hands on hips, and differently coloured pants? That's right, Superman. This comes from Henry VIII. But seriously, this sense of devastation and betrayal and loss changed Henry. It changed him entirely. We start to see Henry reacting to his enemies in the way of a tyrant. We start to see him treating everyone as potential betrayers. And we start to see him imposing his power as supreme head. He became supreme head of the church 2 years earlier. It's only in 1536 that he starts to impose it. And therefore, this betrayal by Anne is a crucial ingredient, or perceived betrayal, in his transformation into a tyrant. The church that had been created in order to allow their love now became a force for terrible acts. And one of the most important of which, of course, was the dissolution of the monasteries, the destruction of 800 religious houses, the monks and nuns within them put out into the street. This is the greatest land redistribution in England since the Norman conquest, the largest windfall of cash for the crown in English history. It happened nowhere else, and the scars are on the landscape of England today. This was a result of Henry and Anne's love, and of the way that that story turned out. This was a love that transformed him, that killed her, and that changed history. Thank you.
I told you she was a compelling storyteller. Really, thank you very much. I think everyone is quite riveted with this, a story which we've heard in different versions over the years. Now, I just want to kick off this discussion, the brief discussion we have in 15 minutes. How has the story of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn changed over the years?
Namaste to you too.
I don't know, where did that come from? How has this changed? How has the historiography changed? What you're talking about, courtly love, is, some people could argue, is a 21st century version of gender relations. It could be argued. Mm-hmm. But obviously, this is not how people felt all the time. Mm-hmm. Was there an infusion of fresh documentation? Has there been new evidence which has come in? And how, from the, say, about the 17th to the 21st, has the story changed?
Okay, so this is a massive question. I'll try and answer it succinctly. So, I mean, I mentioned some of the different interpretations of Henry's character, and that's been crucial. There was a great shift in seeing Cromwell as utterly the dominant figure. G.R. Elton, the granddaddy of Tudor history, would argue that Henry was very much a pawn that was used by his ministers as they wished. The sort of reaction to that came from people like David Starkey, who originally actually was G.R. Elton's student, but then started to argue that that Henry was really a monster and destroyed Anne because he was already that, you know, that he was tired of her abrasive character, you know, that sort of thing. Now, I think the shift to talk about courtly love is important, because it's true that some people have seen that as a literary phenomenon and not recognized it as actually happening. And maybe that is indeed true of the 14th century. In the 16th century at the Tudor court, however, they were playing at it. And we can see this in all sorts of ways. I showed you the Shrove Tuesday pageant. All of these pageants were on the theme of courtly love. We have the reconstruction of the Great Hall at Hampton Court, a room about the size of this tent, which is designed to look like a medieval lord's hall in the sort of tradition of Beowulf. There's even a hearth put in it even though evidence of the paint from 1924 suggests that there was no soot, it was never used. So it's there for show. So there's a game of courtly love going on. I think also the crucial thing that's happened is actually what you say about 21st century gender. I think actually understanding, historians have taken an interest in gender studies that they didn't do before, to understand that actually Henry VIII too had an anxious masculinity, you know, that he himself, the great tyrant, the great king, actually could be undermined by these words in the court, does change the pallor of the story. And so I think it's not so much that there's grand, new, fresh evidence, delightful as that would be, but that our understandings of what mattered maybe have changed.
Well, the second question, which really follows on, is the one about Cromwell. I think it's so tempting to paint Cromwell as the archetypal villain, the man who conspired against Wolsey, then again who conspired against Anne Boleyn, and then finally got undone, hoist with his own petard, in a sense. So, does the figure of Cromwell, is there something a little more substantive to the figure of Cromwell than the scheming, conniving man who's portrayed in films?
Well, Cromwell was very much Henry's servant. He did what Henry told him to do. He obviously was a man who believed in the Protestant faith, and he did try and enact that in various ways. And exactly how court politics worked, to what extent it came from Henry and to what extent it came from Cromwell, is harder to say exactly, the Reformation. But I would say that Cromwell was Henry's servant. He was also quite a ruthless man. If any of you have read Hilary Mantel's books and have been charmed by her vision of Cromwell, I would urge you to think and reflect on the fact that this was a man who could write, item, the Abbot of Glastonbury to be tried and executed. So he's very much a ruthless man. He's a bit of a thug, really. But he's a loyal, conscientious, intelligent, principled man in his own way, except those principles will extend to using whatever means necessary to get the end.
And final question, which I haven't, before I open it to the audience, is, to a very large extent, your rendering of the Anne Boleyn Henry VIII story could be said to also do a little bit of injustice to Henry VIII, because while being a man who got anger at his so-called perceived loss of manhood led to unforeseen circumstances. There was also Henry VIII, the architect of the Reformation, Henry VIII, architect, the founder of British Empire, if you could call it, Henry VIII, the British as a maritime power could also sometimes be attributed to Henry VIII. So if we were to view this whole episode only through the prism of Anne Boleyn and the Catherine of Aragon story, are we doing a little injustice to Henry VIII?
Absolutely. There's much more to say. If you invite me back, I'll talk about it next time. But there's the founding of the Navy. There's all sorts of extraordinary things that happen under Henry. I mean, the dissolution of the monasteries is kind of terrible. The destruction of Gothic buildings, the ransacking of medieval libraries, the dissipation of medieval plate. But it absolutely, it's fundamental in changing history. He is certainly a man who was very impressive. I guess I started with that picture of him as being accomplished, of being someone who was clearly charismatic. He inspired people. His opportunities on the battlefield didn't go terribly well. He wanted to be a new Henry V, and when he went to war, that didn't quite work out. He's much grander, he's bigger than real life in some ways, if that's not quite right. But because of who he was, those charismatic people that attract you, there were things that happened in his life, and as a result of the Tudor dynasty, I'd say that England in its later form is largely formed. His use of Parliament, for example, the beginning of the civil service. But I do think that we need to bring back a picture of the man as well as the king. And we need to bring back the fragility as well as the power. And I guess that's what I'm trying to add here.
Absolutely. It's the fragility which comes through very clearly. Now, are there questions to Suzannah? Maybe that... Oh, am I being preferential towards my son?
Hi, Suzannah. Thank you so much for that entire story about Henry and Anne. It's one of my favorite parts of history, definitely. So what I wanted to ask you was that if we go with your theory of how Henry VIII, this was really the turning point for him becoming a tyrant and for everything that came thereafter, one of the constant reminders of Anne Boleyn's betrayal would have been Elizabeth, because she was left behind. So if you could talk a little bit about his relationship with Elizabeth after Anne Boleyn's death and how much of it there really was.
Maybe you could add also the viciousness of Mary Tudor along with it.
So Elizabeth was made illegitimate after Anne's death. He not only killed Anne, he also had their marriage annulled. So Elizabeth became illegitimate. And in fact, Mary, his first child, was also made illegitimate, of course, because of the annulment of the marriage to Catherine of Aragon. So he was waiting for a son, which finally Jane Seymour gave him. In 1536, he passed the Act of Succession, which he took Mary and Elizabeth out of the line of succession. Some 8 years later, when he could see that death was getting nearer, he passed another Act of Succession, or had it passed, where they were put back in the line of succession but not made legitimate, which created all sorts of fun and games for later in the 16th century. So he obviously had a very ambivalent relationship towards her. And it's interesting because whilst Anne was alive, we have accounts of him picking up the 2.5-year-old Elizabeth and dancing with her, spinning her round, after discovering that Catherine of Aragon had died, But we don't have things like this after the event. And so Elizabeth, in many ways, is motherless and fatherless. And it's not until Henry's last wife, Catherine Parr, that she really finds somebody who will mother her and who is a great inspiration for her as a queen. And yes, it's true, later, after her brother has become king, after he dies, her sister becomes queen, and there's a real chance that Elizabeth might die under Mary I, because she's accused of a conspiracy to depose her sister, who's a Catholic. Her sister is the one who has 284 Protestant martyrs burnt, and others die in jail awaiting trial. And Elizabeth grows up in the faith of her mother. She's a Protestant. And it looks very close. Elizabeth is put in the Tower for some weeks and then put under house arrest in Woodstock, but finally manages to make it out when Mary dies, could be proclaimed queen herself.
Ms. Lipscomb, I think in talking about Henry as the architect of empire, the architect of the Reformation, we sometimes forget Anne Boleyn's contribution, perhaps, to the establishment of the Church of England. And in an interesting play, I think it was Howard Bretton's play, we come up with one version of Anne Boleyn, which is that of a Protestant martyr, of the person who somehow slipped William Tyndale's book into Henry's hands, and therefore, set off a chain of events which would eventually lead to the establishment of the Church of England. And then on the other hand, we have some people arguing that it was Anne Boleyn's sexual power which could possibly be attributed to the final establishment of the same church. So I don't know how we can reconcile the two views. How would you see it?
I don't think those two views are at all unreconcilable. It seems to me a woman can be both intelligent and beautiful, so it's possible that she was appealing on more than one level. So if she... I do think there's a problem with talking about her sexual power when they weren't having sex. That always seems to me a strange kind of... there's a whole Madonna complex going on there, actually, that we always think of her as greatly tempting during this period when they were both chaste. That seems a bit problematic to me. But it does seem absolutely that Anne was somebody who had been convinced by the ideas of the Reformation that she had had access to, particularly in France, with the King of France, Francis I's sister, who was Marguerite of Navarre, who was an early reformer. And so Anne does seem to have been, I think, pious. There are historians who disagree, pious in the Protestant faith, and had an influence on Henry. But there were things that she wanted that where he wouldn't go. So there were reforms that she desired that he died very much divorced from Rome, as well as several of his wives, but also a Catholic in all the essentials of his faith.
It's interesting how in the 1930s the analogy with Anne Boleyn was brought upon to Wallace Simpson. I think everyone should give Suzannah a really loud round of applause. I think that was a fascinating, absolutely brilliant talk. It's one of the best we've had in JLF. Thank you very much, Suzannah.
Thank you very much. Yes, please thank Suzannah and Swapan. That was an action-packed story and a session, so thank you.